Whenever something bad happens, games are to blame, and it's all because of children. Won't someone think of the children? Let's chat about it in the comments below, but first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. Long ago, in a land far away, a child played Grand Theft Auto, and it so soiled their pure little minds that the now grown adults simply cannot function without liberating cars from their owners, driving as though the world owes them a favor, and maybe a tank while they're at it. The game industry is constantly inundated by threats to its overall well-being as something of a scapegoat, which is easy to blame. Welcome to the club, says rock music, disco, the movie industry, reading text on a page, and the occult. These days, you can't go a week without something happening somewhere in the world and hearing blame directed at gaming as the ultimate cause of what ails us all. Video games are a funny medium because even today, the industry tries so hard to be taken seriously as an artistic one, which can contain significant emotional impact, but in the very same breath, does not affect people enough as to cause a change in their behavior. It's an odd dichotomy because it's difficult to argue that one can be true without the other. Numerous studies confirm that violent video games do not create violent people, but even with that result, I have a difficult time with the outcome because it's not logical. Things can affect your emotional state, whether that be music, movies, books, or just a comment on your appearance from a random person on the street that you were or weren't meant to hear. To say it again, either something can affect a person emotionally or not. The industry itself seems extremely interested in creating systems that do affect people while fighting the public fight to keep games away from being outwardly perceived to have that power. It would be a good position after all to be able to manipulate customers with those very same people not believing that such manipulation was possible, wouldn't it? However, what does this have to do with children? Well, the common rhetoric is as follows. When a school shooting occurs, instead of all of the stresses of teenage hormones, unknown home life factors, bullying, popularity, slow or fast in some cases transition from childhood into the real world, the blame will fall on video games if even the slightest indication is presented that the kid involved played a game one time. It's an easy argument. The games glorify, reward, and show the ease of killing, and therefore the young impressionable mind, being unable to distinguish the difference between reality and game, will be misled into believing that game logic applies in the real world. I didn't say it was a good argument, just that it's an easy argument. Video games are corrupting our youth with sexual themes, blood shown on screen, achievements for killing, easy access by online predators, early gambling conditioning, and so on and so on. And what is the easiest way to get some nice publicity points for politicians or clicks from the media? Think of the children. It's the children who are easily misled, the children who are too stupid to understand, the children who are the ones affected. It's also conveniently where the mentally ill become especially useful for those looking for a foothold in popular discourse. Both those with mental illness and children are an easy deferment where average Jane and Joe can distance themselves from the discussion, because it affects them by proxy and nobody is calling them easily misled or manipulated directly. And that's where I feel the real danger of this situation comes from. Now, don't get me wrong, the younger a person is, the more impressionable they're likely to be. There's a reason that if you're not religious by the time you're 18, chances are you won't be later on. However, if we acknowledge that games are an emotional medium with the potential to affect the experience of a person, it doesn't really matter how old they are, does it? Let's take those examples from earlier. What is the average age of a gambling addict? How old are people who commit violent acts usually when they cause harm to other people? Are these outcomes really the realm of children? And is it really so dangerous for children to experience these games, so long as there's a parent or similar figure involved to provide additional real-world context? From the parenting side, I've held the belief for a while that parents should teach their kids how to swear properly. The logic is that they're going to learn it at school from their peers anyways. You can't stop this. So instead of burying your head in the sand and telling them that all of these profane words are terrible and they must never use them, something which is as likely as hoping the tide doesn't come back in, you teach them when, where, and why certain words have value. And with any luck, they'll avoid learning that the word fuck is basically an adjective with no power or purpose from some kid at school. The same is true of sex, violence, gambling, and all the rest. Each has a purpose, each has some value, and each has a time and a place. Back to the topic at hand, the average age of gamers is somewhere in the mid-30s. The ESRB, while I may question their means, goals, and funding, is relatively consistent in how they rate video games for content. This means that in general, all of these heavy violence games are supposed to be outside the reach of children. Sexual content in games essentially guarantees a mature rating or higher as well. Now, I'd argue that Fortnite with its teen rating is far more rage-inducing than something like Grand Theft Auto 5, but that may just be what happens when you always lose, as I always do. The only outlier right now is the pseudo-gambling tactics employed by loot boxes, but as I said earlier, has keeping kids out of casinos really stopped gambling addiction? Or just delayed it until the age of majority? With the average age of gamers being so high, it is fair to say that kids are a minority of all gamers, and the games that act as the focal point for outrage are in the general sense not supposed to be played by children already, by virtue of a mature rating. Though of course, given some slip-ups from EA, they are certainly marketed towards that much younger demographic. In each instance, it's fair to ask where the parents were, is it not? Though I'd be hard-pressed to blame said parents, as I know being aware of all things going on in your child's life is an impossibly difficult task, still, playing of these games does come with either an element of parental consent or neglect in some cases. What's kind of sad in all of this is that if you want public attention on a topic, Save the Children always works. I'm rather solidly in the camp that loot boxes in games should be regulated in a similar fashion to gambling. I think it would do the industry a lot of good to set an adults-only rating on games with loot boxes. It would shake up the whole concept of adult-only games, which is basically used for little more than porn right now. But as far as public policy went, it wasn't until politicians started trotting out the Save the Children line that the average citizen started to care about loot boxes in games. The same is often true of the, quote, mentally deficient. It becomes an excuse in much the same way children are used as an excuse. Person X bought loot boxes because they have mental illness Y, which doesn't affect me directly, but I feel sorry for them because it's clearly not their fault. The fact of the matter is that those with mental illness are by and large still perfectly capable of intelligence, folks, and the same goes for children. My issue with all of this, and why I think it's valuable to discuss, is that by making these excuses, public policy influencers such as game media and politicians are hiding the issues, or just defaulting to what is easy because trying to sort out the actual issue is far more difficult. They're chasing a ghost instead of the actual causes. Think of the children as just a way of saying, let's focus on the lowest common denominator in society and make sure our audience doesn't think we're talking about them. We wouldn't want to piss them off. Which is nonsense, because children are not the lowest common denominator at all. Let's take the gambling debate as our case in point. Whether or not someone agrees with me that loot boxes should be regulated in the same way as gambling, it is difficult to argue that the video game industry is not actively using casino tactics in games. I'll toss aside the whole value argument for the moment. A loot box is a Skinner box in the truest sense, and the fact that they often contain skins is maybe worth a tangential giggle. The user, regardless of age, is being actively manipulated, but because of the think of the children debate, they can believe themselves to be unaffected by that manipulation, despite the evidence to the contrary. Is the core of this issue that children should be protected from such manipulation? Has keeping children out of casinos really done anything to stop gambling addiction? Reduced it perhaps, but that's a lot like treating a concussion with headache medication. It's a bit of a personal freedom play more than anything else. Society is okay from a majority perspective with cordoning off sections of life to certain groups. The mentally ill are one of those groups, children are another. It's okay to defer access to these groups so long as the freedom of the many is not impacted. So I don't like when I hear Chris Lee, the political representative out of Hawaii, make claims that we need to regulate loot boxes to protect the children from manipulation. That's bullshit. We need to protect all consumers. Casinos weren't regulated to protect children, they were regulated to stop unethical consumer manipulation from the operators. I don't like when I see news media claiming that games are too violent or we should think of the children, while reporting on a game that was ostensibly designed for adults with a flashy mature rating. And I don't like when I see anyone say that a kid who committed sickening crimes against fellow students played video games, as over 60% of households do, and was therefore somehow forced to do so because the game had that much influence. It ignores the very real problems clearly going on in that kid's life, and some people have the nerve to impose gaming on that child as a root cause. All this shows that when someone says, think of the children, they don't really care about the children at all. Children are just the excuse. Are children really what we should be focusing on when trying to get attention on an issue? I certainly understand that it raises the profile of a situation, but it seems the cost of doing so is at the expense of the actual issue itself not being addressed. Please leave a comment down below. Let's discuss it. Apologies for so few feature creep videos lately. Given the topic, I don't want to just make excuses, so an apology is all that I can give. My name is Tarmack. That's all I have to say.